Well, yeah, I was actually sorry. I just came from talking to white people, so I have to adjust.
Sorry.
You know what I'm saying? Is it on? I don't. Is it? Yeah. So I've adjusted that. All right. So I was really happy.
Welcome, Brad.
I had to be, and then I was all angry, and now I've got to have a different tone. You know, it's different. So anyway, no, but I was really happy to get the invitation because I work in a university, and actually that's where I just was, at a university thing. But the work that we're really trying to do is to set up the Harambee Organisation of Black Unity, which probably has a lot of similarities to PL Umoja. So when I got the invitation, I was like, well, I definitely got to come down and see what's happening and what people are talking about, etc. So one of the things I've got in my hand is a booklet we've kind of put together, 17 figures of the Black liberation struggle, including people like Queen Nzinga, including Yara Santiwa, Malcolm X, obviously, I love Malcolm X. And we tried to say, well, look, let's have, and this is what I'm going to talk about, not for too long, is about trying to have some clarity ideologically about what we're talking about. So when we see black history, typically in the UK, it's like just any black people, right? So all black people put together, and it's like it's all the same. But it's really not all the same. And there are really some quite significant and really important differences in the politics. I mean, black people disagree with each other more than we disagree with white people, probably. I mean, really, on a fundamental level. So we put together, this is radical. This is the liberation struggle. There's no Martin Luther King in this book, right? That's what I'm talking about. And that's really important to say, well, actually, what do we mean by ideology? Which is what I'm going to talk about for like 20 minutes, how long?
Half an hour.
Half an hour? Yeah. What time is it? I want to go for so what I'm going to talk about is, and interestingly for Pan-Africanism, because anybody who grew up in black radical circles in the UK, Pan-Africanism that's what black radicalism is. That's what I always was taught it was. And I'm just about to publish a book called Back to Black, Retelling the Politics of Black Radicalism. And it is a book that says, what is this politics of black radicalism? And in the book, I had planned to do, the Pan-Africanism chapter was going to be, this is the politics of black radicalism. But then I started writing it and I was like, it's not. I mean, it really isn't actually. And I think this is important to say, well, what do we mean by Pan-Africanism? What is the history of Pan-Africanism and what is the legacy of Pan-Africanism? Because there's almost two different Pan-Africanism, if you like. One, which is very radical, which is kind of the politics of black radicalism, and one, which really isn't at all. And I would actually say that actually Pan-Africanism, as we typically talk about it, and I don't know for PL Umoja, what I've heard, they'll sound like this, what we mostly talk about in Pan-Africanism is a particular version that isn't the radical politics that I want to get to, right? And so that's quite controversial with people because people love Pan-Africanism. And when you read a lot about Pan-Africanism, there's this idea that there isn't a founder, it's not one thing, it's lots of things. And this is the kind of ideological confusion which we need to avoid. Because there are, even though I'm saying there's two Pan-Africanisms, they're very distinct, they have different histories, they have different politics, they have different agendas, and they lead to very, very, very different things. So if we're saying we want to have Pan-Africanism, we have to be clear on what that means and what we want. I would say that the typical, like organized Pan-Africanism, formal Pan-Africanism, has its own history. There's a history that formally starts in the UK, actually, in 1900, with the Pan-African Conference that's held in London, held in the Palace of Westminster, I believe. Henry Sylvester Williams is involved. It's not that big. You've got kind of the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie from most of the Caribbean at the time, who come and say, well, let's sit down and let's organize Africa, let's organize what are we going to do, where are we going to go, right? And that Pan-African Congress launches the Pan-African Congress movement. And this is a formalized movement. And there's six officially recognized congresses of Pan-Africanism. The fifth one was the one that is often most famous. That was in Manchester in 1945. That is seen as the launching point for a lot of the African revolutionary struggles which take place. So people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Hastings Banda from Malawi. Actually, Mugabe was there as well. No one ever mentions that Mugabe was there. But Mugabe was at the 5th Pan-African Congress as well. And so you have a lot of these figures who went on to lead African revolutionary struggles, who were at this conference. So again, we started thinking we must be radical, right? This is the politics of Pan-Africanism, etc., etc., etc. But I'm going to say, step back a second, because let's look at what else is happening at the same time, right? So I know you heard of Marcus Garvey. Right, Marcus Garvey is Pan-Africanist? Typically you'd think he's a Pan-Africanist, right? But Garvey is alive and he's around and he's active during the second and third, at least, Pan-African Congresses. By 45 he wasn't around. But in between he was around, right? But he was never part of this Pan-African movement. He was never invited into this Pan-African movement. Ironic given that Marcus Garvey built the biggest, what we'd say is Pan-African organization, right? The Universal Negro Improvement Association had 5 million members across about 50 countries at one point. So this is the biggest Pan-African global organization. The leader of that movement and the people in that movement aren't actually in the Pan-African, formalized Pan-African movement, right? This should tell us something. Straight away, we should think, well, what's going on here? And actually what's going on here, this is the distinction I'm talking about between this more radical version of Garvey's Pan-Africanism and the formalized, organized Pan-African movement, which isn't really radical, and it never really was meant to be radical either. So the fifth Pan-African Congress is 45. Up until 45, the people in that organization were not arguing for independence. That's important. And up until 45, they weren't saying we want independence. What they were saying was we want trusteeship. We want some stay within colonialism, but we just want some power to run the colonies. All right? That's a bourgeois version of Pan-Africanism. It says we keep the structure of it, we just give us some power. All right? But this was the elite, right? This was a bourgeois movement. It really was. Like, this was just the leaders, future leaders, etc., who came to this thing. The big distinction you want to look at ideologically between Garvey's movement and Pan-Africanism, formal Pan-Africanism, would be Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, right? And if you just want to make it, you tend to do this too much, where we just say, like, you've got Martin Luther King and you've got Malcolm X, you've got Du Bois and you've got Garvey, Du Bois and Booker T. So it's a bad way to view history, but also it's quite an interesting way to view history as well, because the differences between these two scholars, if you like, are very instructive as to what Pan-Africanism is and what Pan-Africanism can be. So Du Bois is famous for a number of things. One of those things is, you heard of the talented tenth? What's the talented tenth about? What's that? What is the talented tenth? Yeah, right. So, and this is really, this is so Du Bois changes quite a lot politically over his spectrum of his life. One of the things that never changes with Du Bois is this basic idea that the way you solve the problem of black people is you empower the talented 10. There's a 10%, the best of the race, that Du Bois called it, right? Those are the people that you want to support, they're going to bring together, going to make these changes, and that is at the heart of formal Pan-Africanism. It really is. Those are the people who are invited to these congresses. Those are the people who push that forward, the leaders, right? These big figures, right? And that's really important, because that's very, 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 very different to Garvey's model, right? Garvey's model is 5 million members, grassroots organization. It's a proper body of organization. In fact, Nkrumah, who was friends with Du Bois, liked Du Bois, Du Bois went to Garvey, died in Ghana, etc. He actually calls Du Bois a bourgeois Negro reformist. That's his friend, right? He said bourgeois, but he's being honest. Look, this is honestly, he's not the grassroots. He's not the organizer of the people. He's not. Du Bois never was that. Du Bois was always, let's take the talented 10 and let's let those people lead the struggle. And partly because he's an academic, that's what academics tend to do, right? Ironically, come from me. But partly he's an academic. Partly also you have to take into account colorisms as well, right? Politics we don't like to talk about. But Du Bois hated Garvey. Man, really didn't like him, disliked him for many reasons. But one of the reasons was he was dark, he was black, like a pot. He was pot black, and he didn't like it. And it's not. And it actually calls him stupid, ugly, and black. Actually calls him stupid, ugly, and black. Like really, no, I'm not even making up. That's a true quote from Du Bois, right? Also didn't like him because he was foreign. He's Jamaican, he's not American, doesn't have the same politics, etc. But also there is this big political divide. What are we trying to get to, right? So, with that personal stuff aside, it's important kind of background music give you life. But there are real philosophical differences. And this is kind of the reason why Garvey is never part of that organized Pan-Africanism, right? Because these ideas are actually antithetical. So on the one hand, it's Pan-Africanism was never was never grassroots, it was always up from the top. And the other really important, and probably more important difference with Pan-Africanism and Garveyism is that formalized Pan-Africanism was always bounded within the colonial nation state. So the idea of the colonial nation state has and continues to be, actually, in the way that formalized Pan-Africanism works, has fundamentally not been challenged. So look at what Garvey's saying. Garvey's saying Africa for the Africans. Universal Negro Improvement Association, which effectively is a government for black people. That's what it is, right? Even has, Garvey even gives out like titles like president and ambassador, etc., etc. So if Garvey's model had worked, these countries are disappeared, gone. They don't exist because the nation state can't survive. Right? The whole point of Garveyism is the nation state disappears, and that again is a complete opposite to formalized Pan-Africanism, which has always been organized around the nation state. One, within the colonies, so we're actually again not asking for independence, but two, when you're asking for independence, you're asking for independence of individual nation states. You have to remember who created the nation state of Nigeria. Not Nigerian people, was it? Or South Africa, or Angola. Where else do you find lines, straight lines on a map? Africa's just full of it because the Europeans sat down and literally carved up the continent of Africa. And all these countries are just made up entities. They have no reality but beyond European colonial borders. So why on earth would you want to keep these European colonial borders? It makes no sense, right? For us at least, right? But formalized Pan-Africanism has dealt with this question, but basically dealt with this question and said, let's keep the nation state. It really did. I mean, it really has. So after you have these so if you think about the Fifth Pan-African Congress, and you've got all these leaders, and some of those leaders, so Nkrumah, very radical leader, didn't want to have the colonial nation state, but most of them did. Vast majority of these leaders did. Jomo Kenyatta, Banda, even African socialism, Nyeri, right? Didn't challenge this. What they're basically saying is give us a freedom of your colonial nation state, right? And that's a really important point. And when they come together, and in the 60s, there's a big debate between where do we go? Do we go for a fully federated Africa that doesn't have these borders and maybe keeps them notionally, but in terms of organization, it just gets rid of them? Or do we keep the colonial nation state? And there's a group of countries. So there's the Casablanca group with the more radical, Ghana's involved, Nasser actually in Egypt's involved, saying actually, no, let's do a federal Africa. Even if we keep the borders, let's make them meaningless, right? And let's have a planned economy. And let's pool our resources, etc., etc. And then on the other side, you have the Monrovia group, which actually did include, and it's probably not coincidental, a number of French-speaking countries. So as you're saying about French-speaking and Pan-Africanism not being as advanced, it's sort of true in that argument, right? And they say, no, we're not going to do this. We want the nation state. We want our country. We want our government. And we're not absolutely fundamentally, we will not agree to come together unless you agree that we can keep our colonial borders. And this becomes like a big discussion. And basically what happens is the Casablanca group agree. They say, okay, look, unity is more important. Unity is far more important than this issue, so we're going to unify, we're going to start the Organization of African Unity, and we're going to agree. We write it in the Constitution that your sovereignty as a nation state is sacrosanct and nobody can challenge your national sovereignty. And for me, that tells you everything you need to know about formalized Pan-Africanism. The nation state is one of the biggest problems with Africa. Really is one of the biggest problems today. Because what does a nation state do? It cuts you off from everybody else. And these are completely made up borders, by the way. This make it worse, right? So it cuts you off from your neighbors. It gives particular people power that they like to wield and they like to keep. So even some of these people at the time, Kenyatta was seen as being progressive, or Nyeri seemed to be progressive. How are they still in power 30 years later? Right? They effectively just take the power. It's like, I want the power, I want this, I want my country, I want the state, I want all this pomp, etc., etc. And you have all these big leaders in these African countries who just don't want to give up their power, right? Won't cede any of their control of their power, right? And it's a way they take wealth out of the country. That's another story, right? So it's putting you against each other. It's also what it's doing is it's allowing the West to deal with you as an individual nation state. Now, if you're Togo is like this big. How is Togo going to be able to deal with the West? How can Ghana? Nigeria is massive, but still Nigeria can't deal with the West. But it allows, and if you look at what's happened over since so-called independence, these individual countries have basically just been done over once again by the West because there's no collective power. right? It's very easy to deal with these individual countries. There's a reason why basic states were created. There's a reason why when Europe left, I mean, probably most parts of Africa, there wasn't no massive struggle to leave. They just went, okay, we'll leave, right? We'll leave, we'll give you, but what Britain says, we'll leave, but you're going to have our education system, you're going to have our economic system, you're going to have the leaders that we want you to have, and then we're going to integrate you into our economy, basically. Well, yeah, but have independence, right? And that's what happens across most of the countries, right? In fact, one of the other reasons they gave independence to countries, and the Caribbean is the same reason. You know, one of the main reasons they gave independence? Really, one of the main reasons they gave independence, right about the 60s. You know? One of the main drivers about around the 60s independence. What did we start doing after the Second World War? What did we start? After the Second World War, what did we do? What did black people do? Yeah, we started going to Britain, right? That's one of the main reasons they gave you independence, so you'd stop coming. Like, literally, it really is, right? You look at my dad's passport. My dad's born in what, 47? My dad's passport says Britain, and it's like Jamaica, like it's Manchester, right? It's what we don't understand. I don't have to prove that there were black people here in Roman times to prove that black people have contributed to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was Jamaica. The empire was the United Kingdom. I've just as much, every single member of my family has contributed just as much as any white person in Britain to Britain. Right? The empire, we were actually part of Britain. So when we started coming, the only way for them to stop us coming was to give us independence and say your independent countries now can't migrate to the UK. Because otherwise you can't stop British people in Britain moving from one part of Britain to the other part of Britain. Right? So that's actually one of the main drivers for independence. So the Commonwealth Immigration Act is passed in 62. It's passed in 1962. They passed the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which says independent countries, you can't have migrants, migration is limited. What else happens in 1962? Big event that we all celebrate every year. Well, not all of us, but a big chunk of us in Britain. Jamaican independence. Not a coincidence. Commonwealth Immigration Act, Jamaican independence, Trinidadian independence, and a lot of independence happens after that act, right? To stop you coming, right? So a lot of nation states are a really important way in which they control the African continent today. And if you look at someone like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which is just called the devil, this is what these organizations are. They're the devil, they're evil. And what they do is, they'll go to individual countries and they'll say, okay, let's take Ghana. Ghana's a great example. Ghana is a good example because Ghana, under Nkrumah, takes a protectionist economics and says, look, we're not going to have any foreign rice. We can make our own rice. We don't need European rice or American rice because we can make rice in Africa, right? So up until the 80s, Ghana's rice production booming, producing loads of rice. Farms are booming, everything's booming, Ghana's doing well, etc., etc. And this is the biggest irony. This is the biggest irony of how all this works. Ghanaian government goes to the IMF and the World Bank and says, actually, well, rice is doing really well. We want it to do better. We want to export our rice. Because this is what they always tell. They always tell you, look, if you do what we do what we say, you can export, you can grow your economy, blah, 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 blah. They say, okay, look, let's take a loan from the IMF, World Bank, so we can better irrigate the farmland and then have a really big export of rice production from Ghana. All right? Okay, so they do take the money, take lots of money, they take it, irrigate the land. But when they do this, in this package of aid to individual countries, they also put strings on it. One of the biggest strings is they say you have to follow neoliberal economics. And what does that say? It means you can't ban foreign rice. That would be wrong. If you want to sell your rice, you've got to let other people's rice in. What do you think happened to Ghanaian rice